Welcome back. President Yoon Suk-yeol partook in 16 diplomatic engagements during his 3 official days in Spain for the NATO summit. On Viewpoint today, we have a panel of foreign journalists and their take on his debut on the international stage. I have ANDRES SANCHEZ BRAUN, correspondent for EFE Spain, here in the studio. ANDRES, welcome back.
Thank you for having us here as always.
I also have Frank Smith with Deutsche Welle live on the line. Frank, it's good to have you with us as well.
Good to be back and see you, Sunhee and Andres.
Right, Andres, we'll start here in the studio then. This year's NATO summit included leaders from the Asia-Pacific region. How was this unprecedented event, if I may, covered by the Spanish media, Andres?
Well, as you pointed out, it was the first time that these 4 countries, that is Korea, New Zealand, Japan, and Australia, were present at a NATO summit as associated countries. The extended summit that these 4 countries had was covered by Spanish media, and it was regarded as, let's say, a pledge to solidify support for NATO from these 4 countries, of course. But it was also read, let's say, the other way around, because this was, we can call it a historic NATO summit, not only because the summit itself seemed to have revitalized an organization that was not going through its best time just a couple of years ago. It has also solidified, let's say, opposition towards Russia. But for the first time, I think, what it has done, it has placed NATO, which is a US-led organization, but let's not forget that mostly comprised by European countries. This summit has placed NATO for the first time, I would say, at the forefront of Washington's power struggle with Beijing. And this, for many European countries, is not only new, but a little bit unsettling also, because to many of these European countries and the EU itself, China is their biggest trading partner. So this would mark, let's say, the start of the end of this European ambiguity towards China, probably. And it also actually puts many of these European countries, for the first time, in the shoes of countries like Korea, which has a very important trading relationship. China is the biggest trading partner for South Korea, but South Korea also has, in the United States, its biggest military ally. So I think that was worth noting, and I think Spanish media did report on that quite extensively, actually.
Right, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But first then, Frank, President Yoon Suk-yeol, like I mentioned earlier, had a very busy agenda in Spain, to say the least. What do you suppose, Frank, was behind this perhaps hectic schedule?
Well, I think a big part of this was positioning South Korea on the world stage. We have a new leader here, of course, Yoon Suk-yeol, and he wants to kind of state South Korea's orientation to the world. This was the first time that a South Korean president had attended a NATO summit. He wants to establish a mission to NATO in Brussels and sign a cooperation agreement between South Korea and NATO. So again, it's positioning and outlining South Korea's position on the world stage. Moving forward, we're likely to see Yoon Suk-yeol participate more in the international community. He also sought a response from NATO and from South Korea's allies around the world, a response to North Korea's recent provocations with rumors suggesting North Korea might conduct a nuclear test. Certainly, the Yoon administration wants to gather as much sort of alliance support to push back against that kind of thing. It's also was something of a sales, trip to promote South Korea's weapons internationally, and also South Korea's nuclear power plants, in addition, of course, to the mainstay of South Korea's exports, electronics. So multiple sort of levels of initiatives from the South Korean president to attend this NATO summit. Sunhee?
Right, and staying with those multiple levels then, let's focus now then on the diplomatic efforts. Andres, addressing members of the NATO summit, President Yoon Suk-yeol warned of threats to universal values, while during his trilateral talks with his US and Japanese counterparts, he highlighted the importance, of course, of a unified and firm front against North Korea's provocations. How, Andres, would you assess his debut on the multilateral diplomatic stage?
Well, I think his debut, it was actually his debut, as we know, was pretty much in line with, I believe, what were his pledges during campaigning on when it comes to foreign policy. As Frank just pointed out, and you just pointed out, during the trilateral summit between Korea, Japan, and the U.S., of course, the North Korean issue was brought to the forefront. It was underlined once again that North Korea seems to be ready to conduct its seventh nuclear test and the danger that that implies. But also, I think it's important to note that for, I would say, another 4 reasons I could point out. Well, North Korea would be one. And North Korea was actually brought up also in, I believe, almost every bilateral that he had, in every single one of them, actually. The countries, the leaders that met with Yoon actually showed their support for President Yoon's, compromise to achieve denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula. That would be one. And also President Yoon making a harder stance on what needs to be done when it comes to responding to North Korea. The second thing would be, as you mentioned, talking about shared values. He talked a lot about the importance of the rule of law and how Korea and all these countries, these NATO countries and associated countries, actually do share these values. And how important it is at a time like this when, on different degrees, but mostly, I would say, in every single one of these countries, these values are compromised right now. And I can't think of a better way when it comes to defending these assets than aligning and associating. The third thing I would say was Yoon once again stressed, like he did during his campaign, that Korea has grown economically, culturally. It is a big player in so many aspects in the world now, and it needs to up its game also at the international level and engage the country with the international community on a bigger level. And I think this message was actually received on the other side, especially from European countries, and it was very well received because, when you talk to European diplomats many times, they do point out that many times it is a bit of a struggle to engage with Korea because of how much Korea, how much resources Korea puts on, we could call it a Northeastern Asian / United States axis. It is engaged basically with the United States, North Korea, China, and Japan on such strong levels that there's little other room for engagement. So I think that this message from President Yoon was very, very well received by European countries. The fourth and final one, I'll be finished, was that on his way back, he actually did point out that he enjoyed being able to briefly meet, if you could call it that, with Prime Minister Kishida Fumio from Japan. He held the trilateral summit with President Biden too, and then the quadrilateral one with Australia and New Zealand as well. And he pointed out how important it is to be able to address what he calls past issues and future issues within the same conversation in order to move forward. So these are 4 things that I think point out that all that he said during this summit was pretty much on par with what he had talked about during his campaigning. Definitely.
Right. Frank, pundits say President Yoon's presence at the NATO summit itself stands as indication perhaps of his support of NATO's new strategy with regard to Russia and China. How does this stance then look to affect the Yoon administration's ties with China, do you think?
Well, I think relations between South Korea and China are headed for a bumpy road. After all, Yoon Suk-yeol really campaigned and has so far in administration pursued the reorientation of South Korean foreign policy and foreign relations toward the United States. That's going to rub China the wrong way. We've already seen sort of murmurs of that. China will be on board, for example, I think more or less with South Korea's pushback against North Korea in terms of its provocations, missile launches, and if it does conduct a nuclear test. After all, there have been reports that China actually has been pressuring North Korea not to conduct another nuclear test. And, there's likely going to be a dilemma for China and perhaps even Russia at the UN Security Council. If North Korea conducts another nuclear test, will they continue to sort of support resistance at the council, and will they support and block another resolution against North Korea should Pyongyang conduct another test? The question will be, again, if Yoon Suk-yeol, how far down this road in terms of developing a U.S.-Japan alliance does he go? Does it include, for example, another thing he floated during the campaign was the deployment of another THAAD battery for the Seoul area, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. That's an American anti-ballistic missile system in South Korea that really kind of offended China. We saw economic sort of repercussions when the first THAAD battery was deployed back in, I think, 2016, 2017. So if Yoon pursues, again, this security alliance, another deployment of THAAD, perhaps large-scale military drills, certainly that's going to offend China further. Also, South Korea has already started and perhaps will more pursue the diversification of its foreign trade, so it's less kind of dependent on its trade relationship with China moving forward. But certainly relations with China, I think, are headed for a bit of turbulence here. Sunhee?
Right. Andres, beyond security then, included in President Yoon's Madrid agenda was a luncheon meeting with Spanish business leaders. What can you tell us about that encounter and its broader implications?
Well, actually, Spanish business leaders highly appreciated the fact that President Yoon set up time apart to meet them, because apparently he was the only foreign leader that actually did this. During the meeting, President Yoon actually shared his concerns over high inflation or issues concerning the supply chains. And he was met there by Vice Minister of Commerce, Spanish Vice Minister of Commerce, Xiana Mendes, who was here actually in Korea in 2019 when the King and Queen of Spain visited the country. She underlined actually the fact that Korea is Spain's third largest trade partner in the region after China and Japan, that is, and how there's actually apparently a lot of room for growth in that respect. But I would say that the most important part of this meeting was the fact that President Yoon actually got to see with his own eyes what some of the structural, some of the investment plans for these Spanish companies look like in Korea for the coming years. We're talking about companies, for example, related to clean energies or auto parts. And I think the fact that the president got to see this, got a grasp on what Korea means for Spanish companies on the investment field was actually a very, very positive thing for these business leaders, definitely.
Right. Frank, President Yoon also met with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on the sidelines of the NATO summit. What can you share with us about this particular exchange?
Well, the primary part of this meeting with Prime Minister Trudeau and President Yoon Suk-yeol focused on kind of welcoming these Asian Pacific countries, New Zealand, Australia, and Japan, and of course South Korea, into some type of closer relationship with NATO. Also, they talked about Canadian support for Yoon Suk-yeol's sort of more hardline on North Korea's provocation and potential nuclear tests, and also discussed the desire to deepen the two countries' economic and trade relationship. Also, for me, something that resonated was the Prime Minister and Yoon Suk-yeol talking about the Canadian sacrifice here during the Korean War. Just in the past week, I covered this issue down in Busan. John Robert Cormier, who served in the Korean War, was buried at the United Nations cemetery down in Busan about 10 days ago. He served right along the DMZ in 1952 and was involved in very fierce fighting. He was injured there, suffering a shrapnel wound, and even after treatment at a MASH unit returned to his battalion to defend the DMZ. And sometimes, Canadians and other foreigners in South Korea, including certainly myself, we forget about the sacrifice made to keep South Korea, a democratic, liberal, laissez-faire member of the democratic, group of countries. And I was reminded of that during that coverage, which was interesting for me.
Right, Frank, thank you for shedding light on that, of course, then. Andres, like you mentioned then, President Yoon talked about energy with Spanish business people, but he also addressed energy and the environment with his regional counterparts, as well as his European counterparts, of course. And that being said, what were some of the notable exchanges on that particular front?
Well, actually, President Yoon, I believe, held something like 10 bilateral meetings, which sounds extremely tiring for such a short span of time. But regarding those issues, for example, he did meet the Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese, and he actually conveyed Korea's interest in taking part of, for example, the green hydrogen projects going on in Australia, which seem to be actually pretty big. He also met the Danish Premier, Mette Frederiksen, and they both, talked about bringing bigger support to what both countries share. It's called a Green Strategic Comprehensive Partnership. And they vowed greater support, for example, when it comes to offshore wind farms in that respect. When it comes to nuclear power, Yoon met with Emmanuel Macron, who is the president of France, a country that, as you know, is one of the biggest players in the world when it comes to nuclear energy. They both vowed to increase support for common projects in, for example, nuclear power security technologies. And then also, President Yoon met with his counterparts from the Czech Republic and Poland, for example, where he actually showed, Korean businesses' interest in, for example, winning bids when it comes to nuclear power future projects being built in these countries. So, in that respect, a lot was actually talked about during these bilaterals.
Right, that is true. Moving forward, Frank, as South Korea seeks to perhaps strengthen its alliances with its democratic partners, North Korea has made heated accusations about US-led efforts to establish perhaps an Asian-style NATO with South Korea and Japan. Is there any truth to these allegations, or do you suppose Pyongyang is simply seeking a pretext for more provocations?
Sure, I think there's truth to that. Certainly the United States and the Yoon administration want to strengthen their alliance and even, participate, South Korea and Japan participate in a trilateral alliance. And certainly North Korea should be concerned about that. I mean, the U.S. Militarily is far superior to probably any country in the world, and certainly North Korea, along with South Korea, is a superior military, certainly technologically, than North Korea. The question is whether the sort of stick is going to encourage North Korea to change course. Under the previous Moon Jae-in administration, a kind of olive branch was extended to North Korea, seeking more engagement to see if North Korea could be encouraged to negotiate toward denuclearization. Now with the Yoon administration, we're going to see a stronger position, a little bit more of the stick, to try to bring North Korea into talks on denuclearization. So far this year, with the missile tests that took place so far, and also potentially a nuclear test, it remains to be seen if we'll see, the desired outcome. But that's the strategy that the Yoon administration is going to pursue here.
Right. And Andres, come this Sunday, this week that is, the Yoon administration marks 2 months in office, and depending on whom you ask, little or much has been achieved. What are your thoughts with regard to the Yoon administration's future path to realizing their pledges, and what are the potential hurdles?
Well, definitely 2 months is a very short span of time to achieve anything in office. But talking about hurdles, I can think that, of course, the Yoon administration is facing a series of global hurdles that basically any international leader is facing now. We can think of inflation, and we saw today that June's inflation in Korea was the highest since November 1998. We're talking about historic levels of increase in prices. There's the fears of recession. There's the war in Ukraine. There's the problems in the supply chains. There's, if you want to, the power struggle between the U.S. and China. On the more particular side, then of course the Yoon administration faces important challenges once again in the real estate market. We know that. Ways to cap maybe growing inequality in the country too. And unfortunately, I would have to say North Korea, because even though a lot of people don't seem that interested right now in North Korea, including South Koreans, because the country has been unwilling to engage for more than 2 years, that is. Unfortunately, the 7th nuclear test seems ready and on track. And if it does happen, as Frank pointed out, this is going to put the whole region in a very difficult situation. We really don't know what Russia and China's position are going to be after this. And this definitely is going to pose a challenge for the government, which is also facing the fact that North Korea is just building more and more and more very sophisticated, very dangerous weapons.
Right. And that being said, Frank, very briefly speaking, a few words of humble advice from you to the government with regard to navigating this difficult security and economic challenges.
Well, I'd say, South Korea has charted a course quite a few decades ago, couple of generations ago, and I think now with these challenging times, hopefully the country and its leadership will remember its values. Certainly, that's something that Yoon Suk-yeol has talked about. At the same time, I'd like to see the political leaders around the world, and especially here in South Korea, exercise a little bit more consensus in terms of executing its foreign policy, rather than go back and forth to different sort of strategies. Try to stay on a sort of charted course over more than just a 4-year presidential term. Sunny?
Right. All right, Frank, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts and your time. And Andres here in the studio, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, and great to see Frank, even though
good to be here and meet with you guys.
Thank you.